Good evening, class. We're going to breeze through several things today as we get prepared to launch right into your informative and your persuasive speeches. There's a lot going on out there that gives you a rich background which to draw from. And what I mean by saying out there is the valuable or invaluable sources you have right now as you watch the 2016 elections heat up and the worldwide news, things that are going around all around this world. So tune in when you can to things like the debates, things like election speeches, and listen with, of course, not necessarily am I encouraging you to listen in one way or another with any partiality, but listen in a way that you can look for when speakers are on cue or off cue as far as their speaking ability and the type of information. Look for the type of information that they're presenting and the believability and the credibility. It's a valuable time to be taking a speech class and being able to evaluate and watch how some of the most important leaders in America are able to present their information and are able to persuade voters even as they go to the polls. So take note on who scores and how they score and how whether you think it's legitimate or not and why. And then take your cue from some of those and be able to apply those lessons learned rapidly as you're developing your own style. And also, you'll want to note and measure what things that you don't want to do in your own speeches. Chapters 3, 4, 5, and 6 really lay out a foundation for the content and somewhat the delivery, but mostly for the content of your speeches. Just as a quick review, as I looked at your introductions, and I do want to remind you, when you are presenting yourself on video, it is extremely important that you make sure that your camera is set at least at eye level. And if that means placing your phone on a shelf, a bookshelf, so that your camera could be at least at eye level or above, so that you're not looking down into your camera, so that it appears to your classmates and to me that you're actually looking at us. That would be most beneficial. Make sure that there's proper lighting on your face. Make sure that the things that are around you in that video are appropriate and don't distract from what you're saying, and that, if anything, may add to what you're saying and add to the background. So all of that said, your content is what we're going to mostly discuss. Academic honesty, listening ethically. Those are some of the titles, the headliners of your material that you've been reading. Avoiding plagiarism. In other words, presenting ideas that are not your own. That's probably one of the most important things that I can talk to you about right now for a few minutes. Avoiding plagiarism. I believe that most students, most people do not intentionally plagiarize. They don't intentionally plagiarize. Let me emphasize that. Plagiarism is a very serious charge. That means that you simply use somebody else's work as your own. That you neither refer to the source of your material, you don't write it down anywhere, you don't mention where you got the material from, and you claim it as your own, basically. I learned this. Or not even I learned this, but this is a result of something that I did, my study. It's very important, especially in a speech, when people aren't reading your notes, they're not reading your information, that you reference where your information comes from to avoid any thought of plagiarism and also to raise your credibility. When you say that according to a study, students benefit from drinking a lot of water. What study? That would be the point. If you just say, according to a study, students benefit from drinking a lot of water, well, first I'm going to think, well, there's something missing. What study? Who conducted the study? When was the study done? Was this a study that was done 100 years ago? But beyond that, is it real? Are you just making it up? Did you borrow the information? And that adds to your credibility, or it goes to your credibility, your willingness or your extra step to put that into your speech. So make sure that you are sourcing your material. I want to say that for every speech, for every point in your informative speech, in your persuasive speech, even in your editorial, or when somebody talks persuasively, meaning the same thing, I was going to say actually in a tribute, anytime you bring up information, statistics, you need to make sure that it's sourced just as if you were writing a paper. Just as if you were writing a paper. Let me repeat that. When you're writing a paper, you know that you can't just put a quote in there by somebody and not source it. Same thing when you're delivering a speech. You don't just say something and claim it as your own without putting the source in your speech. In many cultures, plagiarism is not a big deal. You'll learn that in your text. I've come across that as a journalist. There are certain cultures where it is okay to kind of take somebody else's work and claim it as your own. There are particular cultures that practice that. We are quick in my world, in the world of journalism, to make sure that our colleagues understand that whatever your culture happens to engage in, that professional journalists don't behave in that way, that you do credit people's work and you don't plagiarize, you don't steal other people's work. Absolutely, you avoid fabrication. You don't just make things up because it sounds better to put it into your speech. That should be understood. So go make sure you thoroughly understand that part of your text. Effective listening. We should all listen when people present their information. Barriers to listening might be language. They might be gender. They might be vocabulary differences. Make sure you don't speak down to people, and that kind of plays into getting to know your audience, and that will come in a later chapter. But remember that this is a college class, and you're speaking to college students, and no matter the background that you might come from in teaching or in working in a county office or elsewhere, you're among college students, so you don't need to dumb down your material. I often say to people, you're not in junior high anymore. We can handle it. Don't give us no duh information. No duh information would be like the student, and this will come a little bit later, but who wants to do their speech on Martin Luther King. Okay, that's fine. You want to do an informative speech on Martin Luther King, and which would be appropriate. Monday's Martin Luther King Day. So the context of timing is all there. But this is a college class. You need to look for something a little bit more challenging, something new about Martin Luther King. Maybe some information that hasn't been already out there and rehashed and told in a way that's perhaps challenging and that will capture our interest or make us think deeply and connect in a way that we haven't previously connected. That is my challenge and our challenge in higher education, that you learn to do that. So our oft-termed phrase is, this is not junior high. You have a bunch of listening strategies in there, developing advanced skills, improving your own comprehension. Study, 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 research and research and research. It's the same thing in writing. As a journalist, I make sure that I investigate and investigate what it is that I am reporting on before I attempt to write a story. Same thing with a speech. You must be prepared to deliver and understand the material before you attempt to pull that speech together. Remember your goals. My goal is to get through this material quickly, so I'm going to speed up the process and not read everything out of the text. Give appropriate feedback when listening. Eye contact is absolutely paramount. Looking at a speaker, every once in a while nodding your head. If asked for it, written feedback, all of those discussion threads that you're engaged in. Not nice speech. What was nice? What part of it was interesting to you? How did you connect? That's appropriate feedback for a speech, for listening, for active listening. On to Chapter 5. Selecting your topic and your purpose for any speech can be a challenge or can come very easily to some people. I love page 57 in the newer text. It says, assess your audience's need to know. Need to know. And it talks about the difference between giving everyday speeches, and that would kind of fit in with the Martin Luther King thing. What is it that people already know, and what is it that they need to know? Something that's a little bit more exciting, that it's not mundane. And now I'm going to give you an example of that. What is it about, say, preparing for a speech that goes beyond putting light on your face? I might say, oh, that means that you need to also put the proper clothing on. I might tell you a little story about how I looked for exactly the right shade of lipstick. Things like that. Details that go beyond just the mundane or what you think that people already know. Things that you say that you think they should know. Their need to know. Are there taboo topics? Absolutely, there are topics that are taboo. You're not going to give an informative speech on a topic such as how to do a pole dance, akin to what you might see in a strip club, and do a demonstrative speech. Absolutely not in this class. You would not give a demonstration or informative speech on how to make a Molotov cocktail or an explosive device. Not appropriate for this class in this context. Those are the types of informative speeches that would be best done elsewhere. So there are topics that are taboo. Interesting, our text talks about race or religion. Race topics can get very interesting. We talk a lot about race in the context of Black Lives Matter, White Lives Matter, All Lives Matter, and those can actually get very, very heated, but also very interesting. There can be appropriate channels in the college classroom to bring up informative discussions on these topics and even informative speeches. Although I would caution you, and even persuasive speeches, to just make sure that you're being balanced and that you are considering our very diverse audience within our classroom, and that you are careful to always connect and to never purposely offend, and to be sensitive to people's diverse origins in presenting information, and to always be accurate and truthful. And I think that all of us who are engaged in discourse with other people can always be civil, even when we have and might have differences of opinion, that we can learn to be, or we can be, or learn to be if we're not civil. And we can present information that is not purposely divisive. Okay. Always consider your personal interests. Some of those speeches, informative speeches that are the best, are those that grow from and bubble up from our very own personal interests. How to play the guitar, for instance, can be a great informative speech. Informing somebody about a charity, you know, how to have an effective missions trip, how to, you know, information about cancer prevention technique. Somebody brought up a speech that they believe will be very informative about some medical issue that provides awareness for something, and asked me, well, will that end up being persuasive? And I thought, well, you know, sometimes information is persuasive. Somebody delivers an informative speech about piano playing, and wow, it speaks to my heart and it makes me want to go out and take lessons, or about famous artwork. And I look at that and I think, wow, I should go to museums more. So it tends to persuade. It's just that it's good information delivered well. The difference is you're not at the end of that speech saying, now go visit a bunch of museums, or you're not using some of the other devices that we'll talk about in persuasive speeches to actually move people to action. They might be moved to action because your informative speech is so well delivered, but you're not actually trying to really get them to do that. And that's what you do in a persuasive speech. You're actively trying to persuade people to movement, to action. So make sure you go through choosing your topic and purpose, and carefully look at those points, because those will really help you to build your speech, no matter what type of speech it is. It's kind of the building blocks. It's the research points that you'll need, the nitty gritty. We've kind of really talked about audience analysis right here, but the chapter 6 talks about the motivation for your audience, the homogeneous audience, your demographics. And as you look around at your audience, and I say look around carefully, but as you look at each other's speeches online and look at each other's discussion threads, you understand that, especially in an online class, but even if you were on campus at California Baptist, and many of you are, that we have a huge, diverse population. And even within our class, we have a very diverse audience. So that can be wonderful, but it can also be a challenge. When I had a student present a speech a while back to a rather large class on how to apply makeup. How to apply makeup. Well, within the first minute of her speech, she lost about 75% of the class. Probably half of the ladies in the class who were older, and most all of the men in the class were absolutely pretty much disinterested, because not only did she not have a model to apply makeup on, she just applied it on herself, and it really kind of fell away, because unless one could relate to that and and some of the men tried. They said, well, I have a wife or a sister, but it just kind of fell short. So really consider your audience and whether or not your audience is going to be somewhat receptive. Save your persuasive speech if you're really trying to get in and make your audience come around to your point of view. But your informative speech needs to really consider your audience. Your persuasive does too, because you're trying to get them at the point of where they are and bring them to your point of view. But for your informative speech especially, try to meet people where they are and keep them engaged for that period of time. Okay. Chapter 6 also talks about credibility in other cultures. This is extremely important. One of the most wonderful things about traveling overseas is to really try to sit back for a while and get to understand the various cultures. And the Middle East is probably the culture that is most different from ours here in America. And even within various countries, from Iraq to Jordan to Israel, those are three of the major countries that I've been in the Middle East. The cultures are different in each of those, and even within different areas and within people groups and religious groups, the cultures are different within those countries. And so one of the big things that I noticed, however, was besides just differences in how people spoke to each other based on religion or based on gender, was a difference in how people addressed each other based on education. Education is highly respected and sought after in the Middle Eastern culture. And so if somebody has earned their doctorate or if they're a teacher, there is a tremendous amount of respect for that person. They are always treated with deference, and that almost can bring a woman above and to rise up to a stature that they would not ordinarily have in an Arabic or a Middle Eastern culture. So even in some of the stories that I wrote, and I am a journalist, a writer as well, I often would retain titles. It's not AP style to use the title doctor, but in an academic setting or for a story where we had several doctors and people along on our trips and people who I would write about, I would retain that title. And that would raise the perception, raise the credibility of that person. And I would notice wherever we would go and wherever those people would speak, there would always be fanfare when they were introduced as the speaker. You know, they're introducing that speaker as Dr. So-and-so, or this teacher, or this journalist. And the credibility factor in those cultures is raised to a whole different level based on your career choice. Nothing like being introduced as a journalist or a writer in the United States, where you basically try to hide sometimes because people look at you suspiciously, like, what are they going to say and how are they going to report it? Okay, so we got through that. On informative speaking itself, I really like on page 199, where the book talks about analyzing your audience's current knowledge. Again, let me reemphasize, don't talk down to people. Don't assume that people don't know things about your subject. Query people, and make sure that you're presenting challenging information. Now, that doesn't mean that if you're a firefighter, presume that we know everything there is about firefighting. We had one gentleman last time I taught this course that gave us a lot of really good information about what it's like to be in the heat of a fire and kind of a day in the life of a firefighter. It was a wonderful walk through his life and some of the challenges that he is presented with. And it gave me a bunch of information that I didn't know about previously. So that was a great time. I like the way that the text breaks out different types of informative speeches. You have demonstrations, which I think are great. I love to see students do demonstrations. Descriptions, describing certain places, describing objects, describing events, presenting reports, reporting about people. That can be some of the most, those can be some of the most heartwarming speeches. Whatever, reporting about issues, whatever you do, whatever type of informative speech you decide to make sure to tell some stories. Make sure to tell some stories. People like to hear stories, just like the few little stories that I've thrown in here and there. Make sure to tell some stories that move your information along. Nobody likes to hear just straight information. This is what you need to do, blah, 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 blah. Tell some stories as you move it along. And give explanations. That was all I really had about informative speaking. As far as persuasive speaking, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back. This is already 26 minutes. Persuasive speaking is what we're going to get into in the next few weeks. You still have another week for your informative speech. So I'm going to come back with persuasive speaking and not get into that tonight. I say tonight because it is tonight for me. And so I'll leave you with, at the end of informative speaking, and pick up on persuasive speaking. Suffice it to say, some of the building blocks are the same. Some of the building blocks are the same for both. Some of the presentation strategies are the same for both. But some of the techniques are radically different. Some of the openers are radically different for persuasion. Some of the rhetoric and what thought patterns go into persuasive speaking can be radically different. So I'll want to come back and give you some more ideas, some more thoughts about that. Persuasive speaking is perhaps where you're watching the State of the Union and the follow-up, watching the debates. That will be of real benefit to you. Okay, have a great weekend. If you're watching this before the weekend, have a great week. If you're watching this as we go into next week. And we will talk more. I just went dark, and I know why. Yes, and we will talk more later. And if you have any questions, call, text, email, and get in touch. Have a great time. Thank you. Bye-bye.